What did Yukio Mishima think of Dostoevsky? And today we are going to hear 3 different quotes on Mishima on another literary heavyweight. And of course, if you guys don't already know, Right Conscious is the headquarters of everything related to Yukio Mishima here on YouTube. If you look at the playlist down below, you will see an ever-blossoming library of videos on Mishima's life, his books, his philosophy, and his thoughts on other authors and thinkers. And I love this video and this combination because for a long time, I said that Mishima is Japan's Proust, that in some of his novels, like in the Sea of Fertility tetralogy, he explores memories and the inner workings of these young men's minds, much like Proust did in Swan's Way, or across the whole series in A Search of Lost Time. But just by chance, last summer, I reread the Sea of Fertility tetralogy and then also read Michael Katz's new translation of the Brothers Karamazov by Dostoevsky. And I was shocked how similar they were because, yes, they lived in different times. They were different religions from different cultures. Dostoevsky is a better writer, but as we're about to see in our first quote, they were both trying to serve a very similar purpose. And in temperament and many other things, especially in Dostoevsky's early life, were very similar. And so enough for me, let us now hear our first quote from Mishima on the Brothers Karamazov. Russian novels like Dostoevsky's The Brothers Karamazov, which cut through to and revealed the frightful depths of the human mind, are completely unsuitable for a retired old politician to read by the hearth. That is such literature as torments, troubles, or encourages young men. And the view arises that, as Heine once aptly stated, however classically perfect literature like that of Goethe, which by no means encourages young men, may be, it is merely infertile. Here, 2 contradictory demands with respect to art befall it from the side of life. That is, there arises the contradiction that a bored, peaceful age produces fully mature art in a sense, but that a fully mature art cannot sufficiently captivate souls that cannot tolerate the anxieties of life. And what Mishima means by this is that he says that our art, our mentality toward art has been neutered. And this is the case for a lot of us now. As I've been saying in a lot of my videos, people love to critique Mishima about the end of his life and some of his actions. But most people have never lived or done anything symbolic or real in their entire life. They are still addicted to video games and the illusions of sports and politics and reality and get to talk shit on their little keyboard, but have done nothing actually important. And we have these illusions of art of, if you watch Midsummer or if you watch any horror film or a lot of the modern art in whatever field that's considered good, it gives us a pseudo-shadow experience because Mishima is talking about here classic society, that in classic British society, you're supposed to sit by the fire at night or with your wife, and as she knits or reads something, you're supposed to read Charles Dickens and kind of contemplate some of these things, but it's not supposed to be this kind of existential crisis. But real literature, things like Dostoevsky and other novels, that's what it does to you. It sends you down into the frightful depths of the human mind and forces you to transform, because there's a lot of art now that does, in a pseudo-shadow way, make you look at those dark realities of humanity. But what does it do to you? And real art transforms the viewer or the receiver, no matter who's receiving it most of the time. I've never met somebody, especially young men, I've never met someone who is necessarily inspired and had their life changed by Goethe. I can sit and be like, wow, this is really important. This is canonical. Look at all this stuff that it influenced. Oh my God. But it is very infertile. And that's the goal here on Right Conscious. That's the goal of the literary crusade. We have to bring back meaning. We literally have to inject life into all the sterile beings who are out there, on their phones all day, doing nothing, eating red dye 40, taking whatever medication their doctor thinks they need to take so that they don't need to feel emotions anymore. We need to literally wake the zombies up. And one of the best ways to do it is through literature. And obviously we face a massive crisis in attention span and literacy and like so many other things that aren't going to be easy to overcome. But this is the method. It's not if Kamala or Trump or whoever the hell wins in a couple months or 20 years from now. we've tried almost everything. When you look back over the course of history, politics is just a revolving door. Even religion, a lot of these things. But we've never had an opportunity to awaken and make a whole global population literate and actually self-sufficient, actually emotionally educated enough to stop making violent decisions. We've never been capable of that before. And we're going to be capable of that for the next couple decades. And eventually, with the lockdown, with AI, and with big government surveillance, that stuff won't be allowed anymore. 2020 was a nice preview of how easy it is to lock people down mentally and physically. And so we are living in the bored, peaceful age right now. Nothing happens. People die in their 80s and in their 90s. And that's what makes art so interesting, is that listen to what he's saying here, that fully mature art cannot sufficiently captivate souls that cannot tolerate the anxieties of life. This is why when you maybe go and read Shakespeare or these things, this is why actually Shakespeare should never be taught in schools. I'm teaching this class right now. I'm a high school teacher, and they want me to teach Shakespeare. It's called Fine Arts, and that's like kind of what it's about. It's supposed to be a class where you teach Shakespeare and look at all the classics. But I'm like, absolutely not. Shakespeare is meant to be read alone later in life, and you can kind of see the genius there. It's not something to be forced onto a group of people who are going through these terrible anxieties and in this new technological world. It's a terrible idea, even if it's perfect, even if it is the best. And this is the other thing that people can't wrap their heads around either. And this is why Mishima is one of the GOATs. And he actually can help us kick off a literary crusade, because we don't need perfect people. I know there's cancel culture out there and people freak out over every little thing that someone's ever done wrong or every mistake. But I want people to be sloppy. That's what I try to do. Like, I try in a lot of my interactions with the internet to create contradictions, to not be perfect, because that's the expectation now. Everyone is a kind little citizen who does everything correctly. They were trained in public education to sit there and shut up, and they go to their job and they bite their tongue, and no one doesn't have emotions, because if you have emotions, you're suddenly crazy or bipolar or unstable or have borderline personality disorder, schizophrenia, whatever. And then if you do mess up, you have to go to rehab, or you have to do trauma therapy and apologize to everyone and say how it was because your mom neglected you or you didn't have a father, or like yada, yada, yada. When in reality, we love that. I love screwed up individuals. Why the hell am I still a fan of John Jones in the UFC when he almost killed a pregnant lady, he uses steroids, he beat his wife, like all these crazy things? Because he's really good and he's really screwed up, and it's like a crazy combination. It's like, oh my God. That's what a cage fighter is like. I'm from Las Vegas, and I've been to a lot of UFC events. And I was there when John Jones went against Daniel Cormier again, after he popped for steroids and all this drama happened. And they walked out at the press conference, and everyone booed Daniel Cormier, who's the nicest guy in the world. And when John Jones comes out, he was surprised. He literally went like this. He couldn't even, he was shocked that everyone was cheering for him. And lo and behold, me and my buddy were there just screaming in praise for him, because it's okay to live unconsciously. It's okay to do that. If you look at Dostoevsky's life, what was he doing? He treated his wife like shit. He was a gambling addict in the later years of his life. Even though he had this religious awakening in the Siberian prison camp, he was still a piece of shit for the rest of his life. And before he was a piece of shit, like Dostoevsky wasn't some fucking great person. He was probably maybe even worse than Mishima. People freak out that Mishima killed himself or took a hostage, but he knew the guy who he took hostage. It was all a symbolic staged event so that one day his works would be taken more seriously. And this is what we need. We need young men to be encouraged. That's what we need. Right now, young women and some young men are encouraged, because if you go to Book Talk, they go crazy. When was the last time you saw an event for a Cormac McCarthy meetup? That wasn't the Cormac McCarthy conference. Guess what? I've been to Cormac McCarthy conferences, Hemingway conferences, a Rene Girard conference. Been to even more conferences than that when I was in academia. And they were the most boring fucking events you could ever imagine. No one would want to attend unless you were just like a nerd just trying to get super meta with it. And even then, which I am, I was bored. But if you go to Barnes & Noble or your local bookstore right now, you will see this book. It's a series. It's called A Court of Thorns and Roses by Sarah J. Maas. And I think it's sold over the series, 20 million plus copies. And people go absolutely fucking bananas over it. My wife loves the series. I read the first book. It was honestly, it's just adult, Harry Potter type stuff, but just with much more intense, fairies and all this stuff, whatever. But it isn't the greatest written novel of all time. But they have the fandom for the novel is crazier than you could ever imagine. Like a lot of the scenes, like I read scenes in the first novel, and there are multiple people on YouTube who have like high budget productions that film scenes of this for free or just for I guess money on YouTube. They host balls where people pay $500 and they rent out cathedrals and have these huge parties where everyone cosplays. They have, like I said, tens of thousands of people like acting or making content about this book on TikTok right now. There's probably over easily 100,000 videos, if not closer to 1 million, on this book series. How many videos do we have for Notes from the Underground? How many scenes do we have acted out? I know that's a little bit crazy. All you need is a dude that looks a little bit like a ruffian, make him look a little fucked up and make a dingy room, and boom, we got the set. And if we did that, what would happen? If I made a Notes from the Underground video movie scene right now, all the lip bros, or a Mishima scene, all the lip bros, oh, he killed himself by seppuku. Oh, that's not what Dostoevsky would have wanted. We fucking infight and argue with ourselves as these little 15-year-old girls who are on meds, who are cutting themselves, have mobilized and are kicking our asses. They're laughing. They're just throwing us out of the way, man. And we're blaming the publishing houses. We're blaming TikTok when it's actually our fault, when you have done nothing. They've mobilized random girls in Nebraska that aren't good looking, that don't speak well. They have dudes too that have no merit at all, and they're making videos and they're reaching their friend groups, and it's just moving forward. What have you done? And what's even crazier is all this energy comes from a book that doesn't actually transform you from within. And so that just shows how broken men are in 2024, that we can't even get behind and support anything artistic, philosophical, or important anymore as a unit. We've been obfuscated, divided and conquered, poisoned, and thrown to the wolves. And the same goes for all my women out there. Same thing, like you guys can activate, can be beautiful artists. And so let us move now to our second quotation, because I'll go on about this all day. But our second quote involves Kita Ikki, who is a revolutionary, somewhat akin to Mishima, who tried to overthrow he was a writer, a playwright, a philosopher who tried to overthrow the Japanese government back in 1937 and was executed because of it. And Mishima does a comparison between Kita and Dostoevsky when he says, quote, I can in no way think of Kita as a character in a novel. Unlike Dostoevsky, the personality of a single character must, while giving rise to contradictions, be unified in order for me to think of someone as a character in a novel. And I recognize in Kita still a lively confusion. And so let's break this down. So Dostoevsky, when he writes his character, for instance, if we think of In Crime and Punishment and Raskolnikov, even though he is kind of debating between his intellectual, he is having these intellectual justifications for his murder, and then moving between that and his profound guilt for the murder. It's all integrated in a singular psyche that makes sense. Even in Ivan and the Brothers Karamazov, he has this rational skepticism, but then also this deep yearning for spirituality, but it makes sense. But Mishima thinks that this Kita guy, because Kita had this kind of humanistic, kind of socialist idea of what Japan should be, and wanted to kind of overthrow the government and maybe even avoid World War II and all this other stuff. And Mishima obviously later on was not a fan of communism or socialism, and actually was giving this quote while speaking about kind of the student protests in the late 60s and early 70s that were trying to move Japan to a more socialist or even communist nation. And when you start getting into the Kita stuff, if I'm even saying his name right, I've read a little bit into it, it starts getting really wonky. Like, he was a very strategic individual, but then all the dates and all the stuff that they were of the revolution and stuff were based on prophecy. He was a nationalist, a socialist, a humanist, a revolutionary. He worked within the system of serving the emperor, but still didn't really like him. He had adopted a Chinese orphan that was a Christian, but was very detached toward other people, but loved this kind of orphan that he was raising. Like, Mishima views him, and none of this sounds too crazy to me, but Mishima was mind blown about this guy in one of his earlier essays. And that's a decent compliment, because I wouldn't say that Dostoevsky characters are simple. Like, you're in their minds, and there are a lot of contradictions, and to say that this guy is more complex and confusing than a Dostoevsky character, who a lot of the time, honestly, is very confusing to me, that's a pretty big, I wouldn't call it a compliment, but I guess a pretty big diss. The third quote is something I'm not going to read off to you, but it's when Mishima talks about how kind of critiquing communism and socialism and saying how the Soviet Union has taken 50 years into the early 1960s and 70s to recognize and kind of bring Dostoevsky's work back out into the world because they just censor and control everything over there. And that's not how art and government and stuff should be functioning, which I would agree with. Because what's funny is that Mishima was an aesthetic fascist. He didn't die for the emperor or to restore some system back. He wanted to die as this artistic figure. And so the last Dostoevsky reference we're going to talk about is in the epigraph of Mishima's pretty famous novel, Confessions of a Mask. And what is interesting about Confessions of a Mask is that when Mishima wrote it, he called it a book, it's like a reverse suicide book. He wanted it to, I guess, as a way to cope in post-war Japan, as a kind of means to push back against the materialism that was kind of creeping into the culture, and eventually he saw near the end of his life kind of overtaking it, which I would once again agree with, and now we are witnessing kind of the totality of that. So I just wanted to kind of read this epigraph really fast, and this is from the Brothers Karamazov. Beauty is a terrible and awful thing. It is terrible because it never has and never can be fathomed, for God sets us nothing but riddles. Within beauty, both shores meet and all contradictions exist side by side. I'm not a cultivated man, brother, but I've thought a lot about this. Truly, there are mysteries without end. Too many riddles weigh man down on earth. We guess them as we can and come out of the water dry. Beauty, I cannot bear the thought of a man of noble heart and lofty mind sets out with the ideal of the Madonna and ends with the ideal of Sodom. What's still more awful is that the man with the ideal of Sodom in his soul does not renounce the ideal of the Madonna, and in the bottom of his heart he may still be on fire, sincerely on fire, with the longing for the beautiful ideal, just as in the days of his youthful innocence. Yes, man's heart is wide, too wide indeed. I'd have it narrower. The devil only knows what to make of it. But what the intellect regards as shameful often appears splendidly beautiful to the heart. Is there beauty in Sodom? Believe me, most men find their beauty in Sodom. Do you know this secret? The dreadful thing is that the beauty is not only terrifying, but also mysterious. God and the devil are fighting there, and their battlefield is the heart of man. But a man's heart wants to speak only of its own ache. Listen, now I'll tell you what it says. And so in Confessions of a Mask, the main character is, and no real spoilers here, is suffering. Shouldn't say suffering from. Well, he is suffering because he is a homosexual and cannot kind of live that out in Japan, in his society. Like, he is forced to conform. And so Japan especially kind of had this very high ideal of purity, but then that contrast, and that's kind of what he's saying is the Madonna, but then the Sodom is kind of his base desires, his actually personal desires, which are seen as impure. And Mishima, obviously in his own life, felt this. He was basically a functioning schizophrenic. He was bisexual, maybe a homosexual. We don't exactly know those details. But how would that have looked to this kind of right-wing manly ideal that he was trying to live out? And he understood this, that, you know, his bisexuality or whatever from a young age. And I think also understood kind of this push toward action and toward manliness. Also, even when he was getting bullied, like he was like, I don't want to be this forever. So he was kind of living this dual life. He had the mask on his entire life also. And so when you are stuck in this, it only leads to suffering and internal conflict, which is a sad thing, but that's where a lot of great art is born, and that's where Mishima is trying to take us. So have you ever seen kind of the same prose style or a comparison between Mishima and Dostoevsky's work? I definitely have. And if you have any further quotes that I've maybe missed or not been able to find, or any further thoughts, I would love to hear them. I would love to see you guys in more videos on Mishima or anywhere else on my channel. We cover all the best authors and all the best books here, and I will see you guys very soon.